There's a motto we always say at Roblox. There is no motto. But there's a thing we really do care about, and that's developers. So it's always a privilege when we can bring up our developer of our own, because to us that shows the talent we have in our ecosystem. So again, the word I like to always use is privilege. I am proud to present Brad Sharp, who is on the client team, but most of all, why he's special to me, he worked on Egg Hunt. So without further ado, Brad Sharp.
You got it. Oh, there's no step? Hello, where's my, let me just pull this a little bit closer quickly. It's really loud. So the presentation I actually have in front of me is not mine. Is there a...
Brad, talk about what you worked on before.
Talk about what I worked on before. Where do I start? I've got a slide for this. Like, I was prepared for that. I'll give you... Not that one. Not that one. There. No, next one. DS6. You got it. There we go. Wow.
Yeah, Deepak!
Big round of applause. It's great to see so many of you here today. It's awesome to see so many returning faces, but also great to see so many new faces here today, or at least the ones I can see that aren't obscured by any of the pillars. This is the fourth RDC here in the US, and I'm going to be giving a presentation today on advanced studio tips and tricks that you can use, and I hope that by the end of this presentation, you'll have learned something new that you can use to make your time in studio a little bit more effective. So a little bit about who I am. I'm Brad Sharp, however, you may be more familiar with my screen name, Woot3. I've been a Roblox engineering intern for these past 2 summers. I was one of the Egg Hunt 2018 team leads. I'm a Roblox champion, and I have had a development career on Roblox spanning for 10 years. More recently, I am known as a plugin developer, having created 2 very well-known plugins, which you probably have installed, Waterfall Generator and Light Editor. Before I start with the actual presentation, I'll tell you a little bit about the 2 of these. Light Editor came around when a friend of mine, Sigmund, said that he wanted an easy way to adjust lights in studio. So I went ahead and found a really nice and intuitive way to quickly select a light and make changes to it. Waterfall Generator came around when I saw one of the engineers do something really awesome with beams. He made this really nice looking waterfall, and I was like, how can I make this for myself? So I spent about half an hour in studio just tinkering, trying to get that right look and feel, and then eventually decided that there needs to be a much easier way to do this. So I went ahead and created the plugin to do it. So here's what I'm going to be talking about today. First, I'm going to tell you a little about the settings you can customize in studio. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about shortcuts and how you can use them to speed up your time in studio. Then I'm going to move on to the command bar and tell you how you can use it to really optimize what you do in studio and how you can use that to work for you. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about code management, why you should use it, and best practices to use when doing it. And then I'll talk a little about plugins. Just going to make this text smaller so I can actually read it. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about plugins, widgets and actions, and a new feature that we've been working on and are very excited to announce. And then finally, before I finish, I'll wrap up with Q&A. But just before I do begin, how many of you have already customized Studio to suit your needs? Yeah? Awesome. You can keep his hand up. Maybe he uses Studio occasion. Yeah, he's right. He's right. I'm sorry. OK, so I'll tell you a little bit about settings and what you can customize. Settings are a great way to configure Studio to suit you. You can open them by pressing File in the top left and clicking on the Settings button for those of you who didn't already know. Here are a list of common settings that people usually change, such as the camera speed, the script editor, and the physics debugger. You can change settings with the camera speed, so you can customize how fast it moves around Studio. You can edit the script editor. For example, if you don't like the standard light colors, you can change them to much darker colors. And you can enable different physics options, such as decomposition geometry, which is really useful if you work with meshes or CSG parts. You can also enable a brand new feature called Dark Theme, which we have just recently released. How many of you, just out of curiosity, how many of you are already using Dark Theme? Well, this is awesome. I'm not going to tell you I'm not one of those people. But yeah, no, if you aren't already using Dark Theme, I assure you it's going to be a really big help for late night game jamming tonight. Now I've told you a little bit about settings, I'm going to tell you about shortcuts and how you can use them to optimize your time in studio. Shortcuts are a great way to speed up development, and keyboard shortcuts are just one example of this. You can use them to quickly do actions that you may do frequently just by pressing a few keys on your keyboard. You should memorize the ones you do frequently. For example, I know most of the shortcuts that I use off the top of my head. One of the ones I use most frequently is Control-S, just to make sure that all the work I'm doing is always saved, and I always have a solid backup. I can see you guys over there. You can also customize keyboard shortcuts if there aren't any that suit you, though. So for example, in Roblox, by default, to comment a block of code, you press Control-Shift-C. However, I come from working with IDEs where the default is Control/, and I've changed it in Studio to suit my needs. So now when I press Control/ while working on a script, it will comment out my code. There's a full list of shortcuts that you can find available online and in Studio, as I'll now show you. So you can customize shortcuts by going into Studio, clicking on File, clicking Advanced, and clicking Customize Shortcuts. This will bring up a window that will show you all the shortcuts you have available to you in Studio. As you can see, you've got some that are bound, some that aren't, and we're going to go ahead and show you how you can customize your own. So once I'm done searching through this list, you'll see I'll search for Output, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a shortcut that will open and close the output window. So I'm going to bind this to Command-O, and what that means is that when I press Command-O while in Studio, the output window will open and close. So I'll go ahead and close this window, and then when I've done so, I'll press Command-O, and you'll see that the output window does indeed open and close. The Quick Access toolbar is another tool you can use to quickly perform actions very efficiently. It's located in the top left, and much like keyboard shortcuts, it's fully customizable. Personally, I like to fill this up with windows that I open and close frequently, such as the toolbox. I don't like the toolbox getting in the way of my workflow, so what I do is I have a button, I'll click it, I'll open up the window, I'll insert what I want, then I'll close the toolbox so it's out of the way. Plugins are also able to use this through actions and buttons so that the user can register them as they wish. Oh. Is it going to play? No, it's not. OK. We'll just leave that video. Now I've spoken about shortcuts, the command bar is another feature that is really underutilized by developers. How many of you actually actively are using the command bar? OK, that's actually a lot more than I was expecting. Wow. You should give yourselves a round of applause for that. The command bar is a great tool that you can use to run code snippets in your game to see how they may affect your game, or to just simply run a little bit of code to do a task for you. One bit of code I often find myself writing is a little bit of script called select tool. And what it does is it allows me to select all the parts of a specific color in Workspace so that I can make changes to them. What's great is that the command bar will save anything you write in it for later use. This means that in my case with the select tool plugin, with the select tool command, what I can do is I can run this later and I can change the color without having to rewrite all the code again. Now I've spoken about the command bar, I'm going to tell you a little bit about code management and practices. Code management is really important on Roblox, especially us as game developers dealing with the huge code bases that we do. The Egg Hunt, for example, was over 40,000 different lines of code managed by 7 programmers. And what we had to break down all of this code and make it modular so that we could efficiently organize, find, and make changes to this code. Modules or variants upon them are really important to use, not only in Roblox, but also in the wider world of engineering. They're an industry standard, and they've helped me with my career, but also will help you with your Roblox career and your career as a programmer in the future. Coding practices is always funny to talk about because there's no right way to do things. Instead, I always encourage people to do what works for you, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't follow standards. 3 standards that I tend to follow is I break down large chunks of code into smaller, more modular chunks, which creates logical boundaries and structure in my code. And this, in turn, allows me to easily maintain it. Folders are another really powerful tool you can use. You can use them to group together related bits of code so that they are easy to locate, and you can be really specific with how you require them. You should also be descriptive, and I can't reiterate this point enough. All too often, I see developers just name their code script. And it does not tell me anything about what that script does or how it works. Instead, be descriptive, Make it obvious that what the code does without even needing to read the actual code itself. I'll now tell you a little bit about plugins and how you can use them to streamline your development. Plugins allow you to add extra functionality to Studio, and if it doesn't exist, you should definitely go out and create it, because chances are, if you've thought of it, someone else has thought of it as well and would like it. There's a load of existing plugins out there for you. For example, there's the waterfall generator and light editor that I've created, and there are other great plugins such as the tag editor by Tiffany, which allows you to quickly add tags to instances, and there's also the building tools F3X and SBS. Plugin actions are a feature we've recently added that allow you to register actions that users can use within your plugins. You no longer need to use the user input service to rely on hotkeys for your plugins. Plugin widgets are another very powerful feature we've added. They're 2D dockable windows that allow you to simulate built-in tools or recreate them to suit your needs. For example, I created the Tips plugin, which is a really powerful tool and will open up a little window every time you start Studio to tell you a little fact about Studio that you may not have already known. We're already using this in some of our tools, for example, the terrain editor, and now we're going to be porting the Lua toolbox to work with this. So as you can see, this is a full Lua implementation of the existing toolbox, and we've been working on this for a little while now. All of the APIs that we have created for this toolbox will be available to you as developers, so that if you want to go ahead and make your own toolbox because you don't like ours, you'll be able to do that. And eventually, we plan to open source all our plugins so that you can use them and customize them to your heart's content. If a plugin doesn't exist, you should definitely go ahead and create it. There was already a presentation on this earlier by Doug Banks, and if you haven't seen it, I really recommend watching it again later. There's a great article online on the Developer Hub that you can read at this URL if you want to learn a little bit more about plugin creation. And a little something more about me is recently I've been working on a brand new plugin, which I don't have any pictures for because I purposely didn't want people to find out. But I've been working on a visual script editor that I plan to release in August for you to use as developers if you're not experienced programmers. If you want further tips for Studio, you can go ahead and install my development tips plugin, which you can find by searching tips in the plugin library. To summarize, all of the points I have given you now are really useful for empowering you while working with Studio. And I'll now move on to a question and answer session where you can ask me anything about my personal experience, anything I've discussed, or anything related. I love Jackson. Hello.
Thank you, Brad. My question is, right now, plugin development is not super streamlined, and it's kind of, there's a lot of steps to go through when you're debugging a plugin especially. What do you use to streamline this workflow and make it easier to develop plugins?
So I have a very specific workflow I use in plugins. So I tend to just create an object in ServerScript service, which is like my kind of root for my plugin. And then I'll go ahead and click Save as Local File. And it'll automatically save as, I think it's Save as Local Plugin, sorry. It'll automatically go ahead and save it to the local plugins folder for you to just test in Studio. And then I'll save the place, I'll close the place, and I'll reopen the place. And what that means is that when I reopen the place, I have the most recent version of the plugin, both the source of it and the running version of it that I can test. Is that sufficiently answer?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah? I think that's what most people, I don't know. There might be a better way. Sorry, David.
So I have a quick question about code organization. So say you have a standard framework that you use in all your games. From what I'm hearing, packages, they may be, they'll allow you to sync your framework between your games. But as of right now, how would you do that with, say, GitHub or, another code push repository? How would you, sync your framework across all your games?
So this is an interesting question because we actually did a similar thing to the way GitHub works for the Egg Hunt. And what we did was we essentially had a place where we kept all our source code that we wanted to distribute to all the different worlds, and then we created a plugin that allowed you to later import that code into all the different worlds individually. And we had this place as like, it wasn't team create, so it meant only one person would edit it at a time, and everybody would work offline and write their code offline and then later merge it in manually, which is essentially the Git workflow, right? Does that?
So how would you, like, if you updated one place in the icon, how would you push it to the rest of the places, like if it was in the framework?
So the system wasn't the most efficient, but we could use it because we were only dealing with a small number of worlds. And what we did was we had, the plugin we had allowed any of the developers, not just programmers, to open up one of the worlds, just click a button, and it would import the most recent version of the framework automatically. Awesome.
So to answer, to add a little bit of information onto both of those questions, sorry. First of all, as to you with the code management, there is an API, it's been announced publicly, I'm fairly certain, was HTTP service request async, which allows you to make an HTTP request of any type so that you can work with RESTful API.
Yep.
And that will allow developers to make a direct bridge between their place files and GitHub using their API without actually ever using Git proper. So that's one answer. And one thing I can't give too many details on, but there is a feature I personally am working on that will make plugin development iteration very much faster and easier.
Hey, Brad, thank you for the talk.
That's okay.
How do you discover great, high-quality plugins? Do you go on the website? Do you look on the dev forum?
So something, as far as I'm aware, we're beginning to push is we're going to start essentially making it obvious which plugins are the most popular and which ones are the most useful. So that's not something we do now, per se, but it's something that we're going to do. I actually think the front page of plugins, aside from a few edge cases, is pretty good. Most of the plugins on there, do what they say they're going to do, and they do a pretty good job of doing what they say they're going to do. So, yeah.
Hey, Brad.
Hello.
My question is, you worked on the Egg Hunt, and that was a pretty big team.
Yeah.
What were some hurdles that you guys had to jump over working with so many programmers on such a big project? What kind of stuff challenges you had to overcome, and how did you do that?
So I think two of the biggest ones we had was code quality and just generally sort of merging code together. I remember Thomas and I, for those of you who aren't familiar with who Thomas is, that's Build Thomas. He was one of the other programmers on the project. Thomas and I wrote a lot of the back-end code. And when we wrote it, we occasionally found that we would overwrite one another's changes. So we just kept in full communication about what we were writing, how we were writing it. And that also meant that in turn, if we were, so I wrote a party system for it. And the API for the party system, I gave that to Thomas beforehand, before I'd even finished writing the whole code for it, so Thomas could start using it straight away. The other hurdle was, as I said, code quality. And what we did for that was we just simply read over one another's code just to make sure that before we went live, it did what it said, and we fully tested it with QA as well. So, awesome.
Hi, my name's Dee, and I'm a new developer to Roblox. I was wondering...
How much studio experience do you have?
Not much.
Not much, okay. Didn't think so. No, it's okay.
I was wondering, what are some great plugins to download right away that you would recommend newer developers to download?
So personally, I don't have a lot of experience with building plugins. I very much came around when tools was still a thing for building. I don't know how many other people in here were, but yeah. So I started using Command Util after a little while, which has recently been sort of updated by, I think it's Fractality, as SBS. Somebody might be able to correct me if I'm wrong. So that's one of the plugins I would recommend. There's also some great plugins by Stravant, such as Resize Align. I think there's Wedge Rotate, and things like that, for builders at least. For scripters, I don't tend to use a lot of scripting plugins. I tend to write my own there. So I can't really advise you on that, per se. But yeah. There's sort of two good ones. And the tips plugin, obviously. That's a great way to get started.
So out of all of the potential plugins that haven't been made yet, but you think could be great additions to the platform, what are your top three?
So there's the one I mentioned today, Visual Script Editor, which I think is really important, especially for getting in people who are younger, maybe not as experienced or don't know where to start, used to sort of the workflow and how to write code or code structure. That's probably my first one. My second one is some sort of way to separate workspaces. So you can say sort of, I've written an old version of this plugin already, but essentially a way to like scope into a model, make changes to that model, then jump out of that model again, which is very useful for builders, but also that supports team create. And that's, I think, one of the biggest hurdles, especially that I face. The third one, off the top of my head, I'm not sure, honestly. But I'm sure somebody will create it, and it will be amazing. So.
Thank you. Brad will be in the back to answer any more of your questions. And that concludes our design track for 2018.